and welcome to Atheists Talk on KTNF AM 950, the progressive voice of Minnesota. We appreciate you tuning in or streaming this morning. Today is Sunday, October 20th, 2019. I'm your host, Stephanie Zavan, and my guest today is Alison Gill. During this live show, we welcome your phone calls to 952-946-6205, emails to radio@minnesotaatheists.org, or questions on Twitter directed to Atheists Talk. The non-religious population of the U.S. has grown significantly in the last couple of decades. We're relatively young, we're only a minority non-believer, but aside from that, who are we? What issues are important to us? What do we want from the secular organizations that represent us? Today we're talking with Alison Gill, American Atheists Vice President of Legal and Policy, about the U.S. Secular Survey. This is an ambitious survey that just launched with a goal of getting a better picture of American non-believers and other religious non-religious populations now and for the future. Good morning, Alison. Welcome to Atheists Talk.
Good morning. Thank you for having me.
So did my introduction do a decent job of presenting the reasons for the U.S. Secular Survey?
Yes, I think so. It was fantastic.
Are there other issues that American Atheists was hoping to address with this?
Well, it not only looks at what atheists and non-believers and non-religious folks want out of these secular groups, but also I think it will help arm us with data about this population, so that when we go into Congress or state, legislatures, we're able to talk about what issues people face in their daily lives in a way that will be really helpful for advocacy purposes.
Excellent. And I did notice that you are getting a lot of support from the major secular organizations in the U.S. Are they expecting to be able to use this information for their own purposes as well?
Yes, we're going to make it's not just to benefit American atheists. We're intending for the survey to benefit the entire secular movement. And we're doing that in two ways. We're going to publish a significantly, large report about all the data and make it available to everyone who wants it. And we're also going to make the data itself available to the rest of the secular movement and also researchers and experts. Excellent.
Now, I talked to Juan Navarro-Rivera about a month ago. He's doing a survey for Socioanalytica on political behavior of secular people in the U.S. who are secular. Again, not just atheists, but other people who are not religious. I don't identify with any religion. Do you feel like this has any significant overlap with your survey? Should people be picking one, or should they be responding to all of them?
Well, the truth is that our population is really undersurveyed. We really don't know enough about it, and therefore, I would definitely encourage folks to take part in both of these surveys. Juan was also part of our advisory group for the U.S. Secular Survey, so provided some great feedback on what we put together. I would say that the goal here is not sort of a population demographic survey like what we see with Pew and PRI, for example. The goal is to do a deeper dive into our community and to really understand our issues and people, non-believers, people's lives in a deeper way. Therefore, it's not a population survey. It's more of a convenience sample. We're trying to get as many atheists and non-religious people as possible.
Okay. I did notice, I've already taken the survey, that one of the questions, there obviously are some demographic questions on there, but one of them is related to age cohort. Do you plan to use that data to look at how the secular landscape is changing as more young people become non-believers?
Yes, absolutely. And we know from all the population, demographic surveys that young people are more and more so becoming non-believers. I've seen some surveys that report that the percentage of young people is as high as 13% that identify as atheists or agnostics. So that's an incredibly change over time with this population, this demographic. So when we have this data, we'll be able to report on these different population subgroups And I also hope in the future, after the report is concluded, to be able to take this data individually and break it out and be able to do reports on just this population, for example, of 18 to 24, or also to do reports on other subgroups within our community.
Now, you've been working at American Atheists for a while, and obviously the movement has been around for a while. Do you have any kind of predictions on how we're changing as a group, either between older non-religious people and younger non-religious people, or in any other way that you expect this to break down?
That's a great question, and it's kind of amazing actually. When my background is mostly in the LGBTQ movement. I used to work, for example, at the Human Rights Campaign, and I started with American Atheists back at the beginning of 2018. And the first thing I noticed when I came into the secular movement, more so, is that we have no data about our community in comparison to most other populations and demographics. We don't know many of the things that other populations know about themselves, which makes it much more challenging for us to advocate for ourselves and to really feel like an individual, a community. So I think one of the biggest differences is that there's no federal data collection. The federal government does not collect any of this data about religious groups, including, non-religious people. And so I think that makes a huge difference. A lot of the work I did in the LGBT movement was to add questions about sexual orientation and gender identity onto national surveys so we could get, information about education and health disparities, all those sorts of things. And that will likely not happen for non-religious folks just because of the challenges in that, getting religion onto national surveys. And therefore, we really have to do this work ourselves. And so I don't think I answered your question directly. So if you want to reframe it, please feel free.
As you have been working through this, and atheists are not a notoriously quiet bunch. You've never experienced that, I know. But, has that shaped any of your expectations for what you expect to come out of the survey?
Sure. We've seen so much excitement about this survey. It's kind of been blown us away. This is like a multi-phase project. The first phase was actually at our national convention in Cincinnati this past year, where we did focus groups because, you don't want to move into a national survey without first understanding what the issues are that people have in the community. So you need to do some focus groups to help build the survey. And that's because we lack so much data about the community. So people at the convention loved the survey. They loved talking about their stories. It was one of the most popular things we did at the convention. We did about 12 focus group surveys and interviewed about 100 people. So, we saw there was a lot of interest there. And when we started moving forward with the national survey, we hoped to get 5,000 to 10,000 respondents. On our first day, we got 12,000 respondents,
wow.
Which just goes to show how much people want this and how much interest there is for non-religious people to tell their stories and how lacking it is in our culture. All
right. Were there, as you did the focus groups, because I'm only now connecting them as you mention it, as you did the focus groups, were there concerns that came out or experiences that came out that surprised you and the other people working with American Atheists? Are there groups, for all we're a very loud bunch, are there groups we haven't been listening to even within your core constituency?
Absolutely. I think one thing that was notable was when there were groups of just women, there was a markedly different tone than when there were mixed gender groups or groups of just men. Women were more able to speak about their experiences in an open way, and also they talked about things that affect them more distinctly, like, for example, the lack of childcare for non-religious folks. Like a lot of people across the country people of all stripes go to churches or religious daycares, for example, for young children to allow them to work. And that's an option that churches have used quite a lot in order to help with recruitment too. And that's something that non-religious people often lack, or they have to pretend to be religious in order to get access to sort of daycare for their children. And that was something that came up quite a bit in these focus groups. Another thing I did not expect was the number of people that were concerned about things like climate change. Most people don't connect that directly with being a secular issue. However, it was one of the most issues that people most often talked about in the focus groups.
There is a certain apocalyptic strain in the people who really don't seem to want us to take it very seriously.
Yeah.
All right. We do need to go pretty soon here to the break. I would like to touch just briefly, if it gets long, we'll revisit it when we come back, but why all non-religious people instead of just atheists?
Sure, that's a great question. Well, people identify in many different ways, and most folks, I think, have multiple identities. Like, for example, I'm both an atheist and a humanist, right? And so we don't want to leave anyone out or cut anyone out of the survey. It's meant to be a broad swath of the community and to cover everyone who is non-religious. I feel like, especially if we look at the opposition, they don't differentiate between the different groups. They consider us all part of the evil atheist, humanist secularization of America. So why should we should we exclude people?
Please stay with us through the break, and we will return to Atheists Talk with our guest Alison Gill. I'm Stephanie Zvan, and you're listening to AM 950 KTNF, the progressive voice of Minnesota. Welcome back to AM 950 KTNF, the progressive voice of Minnesota. This is Atheists Talk, and I'm your host, Stephanie Zvan. Join us this afternoon at St. Paul's Rondo Public Library for our October public meeting. At 2 p.m. today, August Berkshire will talk about the many reasons people are not just becoming non-religious, but also losing their belief in a god or gods. The business portion of our meeting does start at 1 p.m. This is a live show, and we welcome questions at 952-946-6205 or email to radio@minnesotaatheists.org. Find us on Twitter or Facebook under Atheists Talk. Today's guest is Alison Gill. Welcome back, Alison.
Thank you.
So as we were going to commercial, you were talking about the fact that the people who are working with us on a lot of these issues are not necessarily non-believers. So we do still want to survey them and not tell them that they don't count. Maybe if they don't identify the way we want them to, or they don't, even if they don't say they don't believe, right?
Well, no, not quite. The survey is for non-religious people and non-believers. They just might not identify as atheists. Like, for example, some identify as humanists or freethinkers or skeptics, but it is for non-religious people. And so if a person identifies as a believer, this is not the right survey for them.
Okay. So this is not that big population that we call the nuns when we're looking at a Pew survey or something like that.
That's exactly right, yes.
Okay.
The nuns, I think, is a broader category.
All right. So let's talk a little bit about what's on the survey. You had a section in there about people's interactions with family and what they experience. Obviously, this is something that we want to be able to talk about as atheists. What kinds of things do you think secular organizations are likely to be able to pull away? What kind of needs can we identify and meet?
Sure. Well, I guess there's sort of two questions there, I think, three that had to do with family. One, we know people are often, unfortunately, especially young people, sort of separated from their family or kicked out of their family based on their beliefs. We know it happens to LGBTQ people, for example, but we don't know the rates at which it might happen to young people that identify as non-believers or non-theists, particularly in some more religious areas of the country. we know that happens sometimes when young people go off to college. They lose track with their family. So sort of family rejection is one issue that we wanted to look at. Another is concealment, and this doesn't just apply to families. It also applies to other areas of people's lives. Like, for example, being at work or at school, or just your friends. How often do you talk about your beliefs as a non-religious person, or are you more likely to conceal them? And then third is, I guess, what a category that we call microaggressions. So areas where being a non-religious person results in sort of minor negative experiences that can stigmatize a person. And I'll give you a good example of that. Often when people go visit their family, for example, they're asked to pretend to be religious for the sake of their, like at the holidays, the sake of their extended family. And so that's something that frequently happens, and it'd be a good example of a microaggression. And so what we have on the survey, one of the questions is sort of like a scale to look at how much people conceal their identities, how much people experience those sorts of that level of stigmatization, because that can impact a person's mental health and also other disparities and outcomes.
And so this is these questions, and I think you had a similar section on community, and I assume you're talking about both at the moment. But so these are addressing really the outcomes of atheists still continuing to be considered a lesser community in some way.
That's exactly right. And, that does vary, I think, by region of the country people live in. In some places, atheists are stigmatized more so than other places. I grew up in New Jersey, where no one really cared. But I think it might be different in the Deep South, for example, or in the Midwest.
Right. And I'm in Minnesota, and we don't talk about those things here necessarily because that's just not polite. That in politics, we never talk about those. But what that means...
Stephanie, that's its own level of concealment.
It is, right.
Yeah, concealment can be harmful. I mean, that's why, we encourage LGBT people to come out and be honest about their lives and identities, because concealment can have, a negative impact on a person's life if they feel afraid to talk about their beliefs.
Right. And that what it means in practice when we don't talk about it is that we are just assumed to be religious. And if we talk about the fact that we're not, I did a library program last year helping to just kind of introduce people to atheists. And one of the questions that I got was, you can't talk about being an atheist basically without telling people that they're wrong, and isn't that kind of rude? And so I had to, of course, point out that, well, religious people are doing that to me all the time. Every time they talk about their religion, they're telling me I'm wrong. So it's just a thing. We're going to have to deal with it. But yeah, just the fact that we are then all not just defaulted, but breaking the silence on that default is an issue.
Yeah, and I think that this survey will help make it easier for people to come out about their beliefs as well. When people see that there are, large numbers of people in their communities and states that are non-religious, they'll be more able to talk about their own beliefs. One aspect of the survey that our researcher remarked that she's never seen before was we have two open-ended questions at the end of the survey about, people first coming to terms with their beliefs and also any experiences of discrimination. And she's never seen so many people, like such a high percentage of people, write in responses. In a lot of surveys, people just take it, answer the questions, and they don't bother to write in responses because it takes extra time.
Right.
But we've seen about a third of people write in responses, which really tells you how much people really want to talk about their stories. So that's fantastic. And honestly, we could do a whole other project delving into that sort of qualitative data after this is done.
And honestly, we probably should, because people who've been in atheist, generally secular organizing for a while, get kind of bored with that talk. Not necessarily bored, but feel like there isn't maybe a place like we don't need to keep doing that forever and ever. And obviously, either there are things we're not touching on, or there is just always going to be this group of people who need that. And knowing that is probably a good thing for all of us.
I agree. And we'll be able to use this data, not just the quantitative data from the report, but also this sort of story data for a number of different purposes. Like, for example, we could, depending on people's experiences of discrimination, relate that to policy goals. We can make this available to local groups as well, and they can understand people's experiences in the community as they come out.
All right. We do need to go to commercial. When we come back, I want to talk about the political issues part of this. But
Great.
Please stay with us through the break, and we will return to Atheists Talk with our guest, Alison Gill. This is Stephanie Zvan, and you're listening to AM 950 KTNF, the progressive voice of Minnesota. Welcome back to Atheists Talk on AM 950 KTNF, the progressive voice of Minnesota. I'm your host, Stephanie Zvan. Atheists Talk is an unusual show. Very few places in the U.S. can someone randomly turn on commercial radio and hear a bunch of atheists talking about the topics that interest them. Much of the work to keep us on the air is done by a dedicated group of volunteers, but we need your help too. Today we'd like to thank in particular Cindy for her monthly sustaining donation and the attendees of the Flying Spaghetti Monster 5th Sunday Dinner. If you'd like to make a tax-deductible donation to our radio fund, please visit minnesotaatheists.org or search for Atheists Talk on Patreon and sign up for exclusive content. Atheist Talk is produced with funding from Minnesota Atheists, American Atheists, and Cucumbers Restaurant. If you'd like to advertise on this program, please contact us at radio@minnesotaatheists.org. Our music is composed by member Brent Michael Davids and used with permission. Opinions expressed on the show are those of the speakers. You can find Minnesota Atheists' public policy positions at minnesotaatheists.org. Consider becoming a member of Minnesota Atheists if you're not already. Support our work and help steer our future direction. If you have a question or comment on today's show, please call us at 952-946-6205, email to radio@minnesotaatheists.org, or find Atheists Talk on Twitter or Facebook. This morning, Alison Gill is talking with us about the U.S. Secular Survey. Welcome back, Alison.
Thank you.
So we've talked quite a bit about the survey at this point, but we haven't really touched on the political issues aside from mentioning that some of those came out of your focus groups at this year's American Atheists Convention. What else should we know about this section? Obviously, I think it's going to be used to determine what issues people work on within the secular movement. Is that correct?
Yes. The purpose of this section of the survey is really to understand what people, well, I guess there's two purposes. What people consider most important, like what they work on and what issues they consider, critical. So it's not just secular issues, it's a little bit broader. And also there's a follow-up question about what issues they believe it's most important for secular organizations to work on. So we're interested in both issues, like what are people concerned about more broadly, and what they think we as American Atheists or the other secular groups in the movement should be more focused on.
All right. And I mean, for our listeners who may not be aware, some of this comes out of years-long, let's call them debates, about what the focus of the secular organizations should be and what should be considered, let's call it mission drift, because a lot of people have. But when it comes right down to it, a lot of these issues that we're looking at, like I mentioned that climate change, the opposition to climate change has a significant, particularly evangelical group working against it. And a lot of these other issues that are brought up on there, obviously abortion rights is an issue where most of the opposition to that is people trying to impose their religion on everybody, right?
That's exactly right. Yes. So a lot of these issues are not just about maintaining the separation of religion and government. They're also about issues where, religious people try to impose their beliefs on the broader society or on atheists and non-religious people, like the ones you're laying out there. And so there's a variety of different issues on the survey. We can't list everything, so we did have to be somewhat selective. I kept having to urge my researcher to add more, and she kept saying, we can't add more. So we did what we could there, but they are a little bit broader than just the standard issues you think of, like displays on public land, for example.
All right. So people have been listening to us talk about this survey for a good half hour now. Where should people go if they want to take it?
Great question. So they should go to secularsurvey.org. So www.secularsurvey.org.
All right. And despite the huge push of participation to start with, I in fact had server issues. You still want more people to take this, obviously.
Yes, definitely. Please do. We had originally intended to keep it open to mid-November. We're getting such a response that I'm not sure we're still going to keep it open quite that long, but definitely until the end of this month. And so I encourage everyone to take the survey while we have it open. It's meant to be for all non-religious people who are 18 years or older and who reside in the U.S. So that's the population that we're surveying. And, we'd like to get as many people as possible.
Excellent. I want to pivot here. When I had Nick Fish on the show in the spring, he talked a little bit about Project Blitz, but I think it would be a shame to have you on the show and not explore this in a little more depth, because you're kind of the Project Blitz person within the entire movement. First off, can you explain to people what Project Blitz is?
Certainly. Project Blitz is a Christian nationalist state legislative campaign. So it's this coordinated campaign meant to introduce as much Christian nationalist legislation in states as possible. It's really focused in three areas: undermining the separation of religion and government, undermining LGBTQ equality, and undermining access to reproductive services. And the sort of the way they do this is through a focus on what they call religious freedom, which is really more of a distorted vision of religious freedom, where they enshrine Christian nationalism into the law.
And what does this look like in practice? How are these people organized? What are they actually doing?
They have established what they're called prayer caucuses in states around the country. There are, I believe, last count, about 33 different prayer caucuses in different states, including Minnesota, that focus on this Christian nationalist legislation.
We are the land of Michelle Bachmann, so we should probably be expecting that. But I'm sorry. Go on.
I'm sorry, I didn't catch that.
Oh, we are the land of Michelle Bachmann. We should probably be expecting that. But that is a digression.
Yes. So that's one component of Project Blitz. The other component is this policy guide that they put out. So far, it's been every year. And what it has is about 22, I think, model policies or model pieces of legislation that they're able to introduce in different states. And they're sort of like ALEC, if you've heard of ALEC, which is more of a corporate business model of taking model bills and introducing them in different states. Well, this is the Christian nationalist version of ALEC, trying to introduce these bills in different states. And
when we're talking about nationalism, because that's been, I think, a very misunderstood word over the last few years for a variety of reasons, what are we talking about with nationalism?
Sure. I think I want to use the term Christian nationalism just to be clear, because it's a little bit distinct. Nationalism can mean a lot of things in a lot of different contexts. But Christian nationalism it has a number of different associated beliefs and subcategories. But the primary belief is that America was founded as a Christian nation, and that we've moved away from that, and that we should move back towards being a Christian nation. Things like the separation of religion and government are sort of false and untrue. and I'm just explaining what the belief is. It's not something we
Right.
believe by any measure. And that basically the problems that are resulting in America are from moving away from this, Christian founding.
And this, as you explain that, sounds very much like the beliefs behind the groups that were against teaching evolution in the school and for teaching creationism. Is this kind of a response to the big defeats that those groups were handed over the last decade or so?
I think that's true. I don't think you don't necessarily need to be a creationist to be a Christian nationalist. I think people probably have different beliefs on that. And I also believe that Christian nationalism is really more of a political movement than a religious movement. I mean, it uses religion to sort of exert control, but it is a really concerted, carefully constructed political movement.
Oh, again, though, this is I'm not correcting you. I want to expand on that. This is not a new thing. This is something that we saw to maintain segregation. This is something that we saw as the beginning of the push to really lower taxes on people who make a lot of money and on corporations. This is what we saw in response to the feminist movement, was very much political movements dressed in religion.
Absolutely, yes. And this is just a new repackaging of those strains of, what political sort of thought that we've been seeing. You're right, throughout our country's history. Just taking those ideas, like, for example, people that you tried to use the concept of religious freedom to push back on non-discrimination laws based on race or gender. So it's a sort of a reflowering of those sorts of arguments.
So how long have Project Blitz been working on this, and what kind of progress have they been making?
So I believe Project Blitz got started in 2015, give or take. It's hard to know fully because they're sort of a secretive organization, and they become more secretive as they've gotten more attention over the past year. So they have made a significant level of progress, though. I mentioned that they have 33 prayer caucuses in different states, and that's been expanding rapidly. They've also, I think this past year, they managed to introduce more than 80 pieces of state legislation all across the country in different states. So these are primarily, this year, we saw things like bills promoting "In God We Trust" posters in every school classroom and, in public schools. So mandatory posters to put out the idea that this is basically a Christian nation through the motto on school walls. And then the other thing we saw that was very popular this year is bills requiring schools to have Bible classes. So these are elective Bible classes. This was an issue that was supported by the president. He came out vocally in favor of it. So we just saw an explosion of these types of bills around the country.
Well, we do need to go to commercial relatively soon, but what other kinds of issues or bills, when we're seeing them, should we know are Project Blitz backed?
Sure. Well, some of the other types of bills we see are bills we've actually seen for many years, sort of, that are brought into the Project Blitz policy guide. Things like state religious freedom restoration acts, which seek to create religious exemptions in the law. And also bills, for example, that would allow discrimination in foster care and adoption, so that, placement agencies that receive state funding are then able to discriminate based on their religious beliefs. And that primarily affects LGBTQ people, but it also affects single people and atheists and non-religious people.
All right. Please stay with us through the break, and we will return to Atheists Talk with our guest, Alison Gill. I'm Stephanie Zavan, and you're listening to AM 950 KTNF, the progressive voice of Minnesota. Welcome back to AM 950 KTNF, the progressive voice of Minnesota. This is Atheists Talk. I'm your host, Stephanie Zavan, and we are talking today with Alison Gill of American Atheists. Welcome back, Alison. Are you there, Alison? Oh, dear. Okay. We will work on that technical issue. In the meantime, I am going to grab a little bit more information about... Hang on a sec. Okay. We have Alison back. Hooray! You know way more about Project Blitz than I do. I was going to try, but it was not going to be pretty. So, obviously, talking about the things that Project Blitz is working on is sobering in general, and particularly for atheists. What is American Atheists working to do to push back or to combat Project Blitz?
Great question. So we've built a national coalition of over 20 different groups to sort of coordinate around opposition to Project Blitz. And this is not just secular groups. Because Project Blitz targets many different issues and movements, including, for example, the reproductive rights movement and the LGBT equality movement, we really have to work with different movements in order to be effectively combat this campaign. And so we've invited many of these other groups to participate, and we've established a campaign website to oppose Project Blitz, which is www.blitzwatch.org. That's blitzwatch.org. And you'll find there all sorts of different resources relating to Project Blitz, including like a legislation tracker to see what's going on in your state, talking points and other sort of materials for advocates to oppose Project Blitz-related bills, and a lot of explanation about what exactly Project Blitz is trying to do and why we're opposing it. And
how have you been at all successful? I know this is a huge undertaking and requires building a lot of infrastructure to get all this out, but what kind of results have you seen?
I think we've been very successful. We've certainly raised the profile of Project Blitz over the past year. Project Blitz, one of its goals was to sort of operate in secrecy by establishing these prayer caucuses and taking lawmakers sort of by surprise. It's really a deceptive campaign, and by exposing it, we can limit its power. What they do is establish these prayer caucuses, which, on its face does not sound like a Christian nationalist thing. It just sounds like a religious thing. So they're able to sort of deceive lawmakers who are religious, who are not all Christian nationalists, into participating in this caucus, which they just think might be about prayer or religion more broadly. And then start off sort of with low-key items, maybe celebrating like the week of the Bible or something like that through a resolution, and then build to worse policies and more destructive legislation over time. And possibly in some states even bringing in people like, Democrats, for example. So it really does, I think by giving people more information about Project Blitz and also some messaging to oppose these bills when they're sort of come up in their states, we're really empowering people to oppose this campaign in a stronger way.
And I kind of want to highlight that about bringing in lawmakers who are not interested in Christian nationalism. We as a movement get pushback sometimes about why do we have to be such hardliners on these really harmless questions of religion and government. And so it turns out that those supposedly harmless issues in and of themselves are kind of a wedge.
Yes, absolutely. Project Blitz guidebooks are really clear about that too. They're meant to escalate. They're meant to start off with things like "In God We Trust" posters in schools. And we've seen, for example, in Florida, they use horrible events like shootings to point to the need for more God in schools. as if, a poster would stop a shooting. But then, you take advantage of those sorts of incidents, introduce these bills, which don't get a lot of opposition. Because when they introduce these bills, and by the way, one was introduced in Minnesota last year, they basically attack lawmakers who stand up and oppose the bills in the legislature. This happened in Minnesota to a senator named Senator John Marty, who opposed the "In God We Trust" in schools bill. And so he got dragged through the mud on places like Fox News and Breitbart for standing up and saying, this is not my religious beliefs. I think this hurts religious freedom. It does not enhance religious freedom.
Right.
And he's been a vocal opponent of Project Blitz since that time.
He is, in general, a wonderful ally on secular issues, religious himself, but he has a very strong understanding of religious freedom.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So let's talk a little bit about what people can do. Obviously, political attention keeps being drawn to the national level. There's a lot going on. But what can, aside from obviously going to Blitz Watch and keeping an eye on their local legislation, what can people do? I mean, we're at an election year. There has to be something we can do. There's always an election year.
Oh, certainly. I mean, I would encourage everyone to, of course, register to vote. That's actually one of the questions on the U.S. Secular Survey. Are you registered to vote? Because our community, non-religious people, tend to undervote based on the size of the population, which limits our effectiveness and power as a community. So it's really critical that we register and that we vote. And I'm not going to encourage anyone to vote in a specific way, but register and definitely vote. And then, of course, you just mentioned the blitzwatch.org site. It has a lot of resources about what Project Blitz and what its aims are. And we also, at American Atheists, have an action alert set up so that you can inform your local lawmakers about Project Blitz, because it's most important that we tell lawmakers about Project Blitz at the state level, because that's where its focus is. And so you can find the action alert at atheists.org, which is our website, www.atheists.org. And when you click on the action alert, it will send an email about Project Blitz to your state senator and state representative so that they can become more informed about this campaign.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Alison. If you're willing to stick around, we will also record a Patreon extra. But in the meantime, I will send people to secularsurvey.org, blitzwatch.org, and obviously atheists.org, isn't it, for American Atheists website?
Yes, it is.
All right. I'd like to thank our audience for tuning in to Atheists Talk. This is Stephanie Zavan, your host. I'm proud to be on the air with Minnesota Atheists, and I hope you appreciate the show. The show depends on the generous support of our members, our sponsors, and our donors. Please consider supporting the show through the donation link at minnesotaatheists.org. This is Atheists Talk on AM 950 KTNF, the progressive voice of Minnesota. The podcast for the show will be on our radio page as soon as possible. Have a great Sunday, everybody.